If you've seen my previous video where I play Bad Apple inside Super Mario Bros., you might be wondering, how? Or maybe, what? Two people asked why. In this video, I'll be walking you through the process I took to create this task. Hopefully by the end, you would have the knowledge to create a similar task yourself. Part 0. A General Understanding. Glossary. This is a TAS, or Tool-Assisted Superplay. In many cases, that S stands for speedrun, but here my goal is to play a music video instead of go fast. Consider a series of musical notes on a timeline. If played in a digital workstation, the computer will always play the notes exactly as written without fail. Surprise! This was an analogy for TASes. Instead of notes on a timeline to play a song, consider button inputs on a timeline to play a video game. When we talk about a tool-assisted run, you might ask how under this context we define a tool. The popular examples are save states and playing the game in slow motion. In this video, I'll be using the hex editor to look at the console's RAM, the trace logger to see every instruction that was executed in a given frame, and as I'll discuss later in the video, we'll be writing our own custom tools. Arbitrary code execution. The ROM data of a NES cartridge is just a bunch of zeros and ones grouped into octets, which we call bytes. A different value of a byte represents a different instruction for the CPU to process. The ROM is just a bunch of bytes. Fun fact, RAM is just a bunch of bytes. For example, in the Super Mario Bros. 3 any% run, the exposition of enemies in the stage can be manipulated to form a jump instruction that runs the game's credits. Now, writing a payload in RAM is not enough for an ACE exploit. We also need some way to move the console's program counter to RAM in order to execute it. In the case of Mario 3, this is performed by hitting an out-of-bounds note block. Something that excites many TASers is what we call total control, the ability to write anything anywhere in RAM and execute it. If we can write and execute any code we want, all we need to do now is figure out what to do with it. ACE in Super Mario Bros. Whenever I make a video showcasing arbitrary code execution in Super Mario Bros., I get the same comment. Mario 1 has ACE? It does. Asterisk. As I'll explain in a minute, it requires manipulating RAM with a different NES game and then swapping cartridges. Quite a few people pointed out that this task happens inside World N. Let's talk about why. When you defeat Bowser with fireballs, he gets replaced with a different object. The object that replaces Bowser is different for every world, but what would happen if you were beyond the 8 regular worlds of Super Mario Bros? For instance, it's possible to spawn Bowser in World 9, though you're unable to spawn a Fire Flower before encountering him. Let's make a table of all 256 worlds in Super Mario Bros. Let's also ignore the first 8 worlds, since we know Bowser is programmed specifically for those worlds. Filtering for worlds that contain Bowser, and then filtering even further for worlds where you can obtain a Fire Flower first, we're left with 13 worlds to investigate. You might be happy to hear that Bowser can be replaced with quite a few other existing objects. A fire bar, a moving platform, even a firework. There are a few worlds where defeating Bowser this way results in a jump to RAM, and this is where we want to investigate. Let's not stall for time here. You know the task is in World N, so what goes on when Bowser is defeated this way in this world? In World N, defeating Bowser with fireballs replaces him with an object with the ID of hex C9. This doesn't immediately jump to RAM, though it does start a chain reaction that will. The state machine's value is incremented, and that will lead to a jump to open bus, which is out of the scope of this video, so I'm just gonna wave my hands around a bit, and we're moving on. This moves the PC to RAM, which allows arbitrary code execution. Though this all relies on being in World N. How do you even get there? For this task, I'll be using a custom version of the BizHawk emulator that will allow me to swap cartridges in the middle of a task. You might be familiar with this trick where you can start Super Mario Bros. Beyond World 8 by playing tennis. I won't be using tennis for this task, but this should hopefully explain how cart swapping is used. Now let's talk about the arbitrary code we'll be running. To begin with, let's examine the code that runs right before the jump to RAM. The value of the state machine is loaded into the A register, and it will jump to code that handles jump tables. This is the code that handles jump tables, but we parse the table out of bounds. This leads us to open bus, which we use to jump to address 1181. The question marks here aren't just because this is RAM, but more specifically, this is uninitialized RAM. Super Mario Bros. Will never write to this area under normal gameplay. For example, if I were to boot up Kirby's Adventure, this area will be filled with some data, but after swapping to Super Mario Bros, it will still be there. Let's do a brief recap, while also explaining some other fun facts about RAM. For instance, there are only hex 800 bytes of RAM, but this is all the way in hex 1100. Due to RAM mirroring, address 1181 has the same value as address 0181. The entire range from address 0160 to 01E4 is never written to by Super Mario Bros. Since we can use another game to write here, and an ace exploit in another game would allow us to write anything here, we've got a golden ticket to execute anything we want. The question is, what do we write here? The goal is to play the Bad Apple music video, but we only have 132 bytes to work with, and that's definitely not enough to put the whole video in. We're going to need to write code that lets us write more code. This will be done by streaming data through the controller ports. Speaking of, how does a set of button presses correspond to a byte? There are 8 buttons on the controller, and each button represents a single bit of an 8-bit value. In this example, I want to write the binary number 01010101. Represented as button inputs, this is B, start, down, and write. Writing our own custom code. If we want to write our own code, we need to know where to write it and how many bytes we wish to write. To determine where we're writing, I'll read from the controller and store this at address C3. This will be the high byte of the 16-bit address. I'll read from the controller again and store it at address C2. This will be the low byte of the address. Now we have the location, let's determine the length. This is done by reading the controller once more, and I'll store it in the same area at address C1. Now, if we look in the hex editor at the region we stored these, we can see how many bytes we want to write and where we want to write it. In this example, I'll be storing hex 34 bytes at address 700. Now to actually write the code at the target address. We're going to use the X register to determine how many bytes we've written so far, so let's set X to 0. I'll read from the controller and write to our target address with the X register being used as an offset. X is incremented, and that will happen in a loop until X is equal to our payload length determined by address C1. Now this is a whole lot of information, so let's actually see this payload in action and how I, as the task developer, can use this. Suppose I want to write some code here at address 210. First, I'll add the 3 controller inputs that form the location and length. 02 is written with just the left button, 10 is written with start, and I'll write 9 bytes here, which is going to be up plus right. Once these inputs are emulated, we'll see this at address C1. I'll paste a series of inputs that form the code I want to write, and as I step through each input, you can see the bytes being written in the hex editor. So that's how we'll write code in this task. Now we have to make a choice. Do I want to write more code at a different location, or do I want to execute some specific code? If I want to write more code, I'll leave the next input blank. If this input isn't blank, we're going to move the PC somewhere. Let's read the controller twice to set up the desired place to move the PC, and then an indirect jump instruction can take it there. Let's see this on the emulator too. We wrote code at address 210, now let's jump to it. First, I'll add anything to this next input so it isn't blank. Now to jump to 210, I'll write 2 and 10. And just like that, I'll step ahead a few inputs, and there it is. Here's the assembly code that I'm using to take these inputs and use them to write code. If you want to read it, go ahead and pause the video. You might wonder how this data is going to be written. That's a lot of bytes to manipulate. I'll be using a very brief total control task of Super Mario Bros. 3. That was it. That was about 3/4 of a second, and everything is all ready for Super Mario Bros. This was likely a lot to take in, so let's recap. A task of Mario 3 is used to write a payload and manipulate RAM so Super Mario Bros. Can begin in World N. Defeating Bowser in World N leads to a chain reaction ending with this payload being executed. This payload allows me to use controller inputs to write my own custom code and execute it. And now, we're ready to talk about the Bad Apple music video. To begin with, let's cover the graphics. The graphics. How to convert the video into Mario tiles. This is all the graphics data of Super Mario Bros. Okay, there's also the object graphics, but we won't be using any of those. If we want to take a frame from the music video, how would we render it using Mario tiles? There are many ways to do this, and in hindsight I probably could have googled for existing code for making mosaics. Alas, I didn't, so here's how I converted the images. I started by shrinking the image down to fit inside the NES resolution. Then, I broke the image down into 8x8 pixel chunks. Let's take a look at one of these chunks. The goal here is to find which character in the Mario graphics is the best fit for this chunk. I'll iterate over every character, so let's begin with this one. My method of determining how close these match was to get the total difference between each pixel. Let me take the brightness of these 2 pixels and add up the difference. We've got 254. Moving on to the next pixel, I'll calculate the difference again, 201. Next pixel, do it again. This repeats for every pixel, and I'll tally up all the differences to get a score. This number will be recorded, and we move on to the next character. I'll run the same process, and if the score is smaller, then this character is now the new best fit. This repeats for every character. And finally, once all have been checked, we have the character that is the best fit. Repeat this for every chunk, and we have the full frame rendered this way. Of course, doing this by hand would take thousands of years to make it through the entire video, so let's write a program to do this for us. This is Visual Studio. I'll begin by making a new .NET Forms C# project. I'll call it Bad Apple TAS. I'll add a button to this application, so all I need to do is click this button, and this function will run. I've got the image scaled down to the proper resolution, so that's a good start. Slap that bad boy in a loop, and we've got ourselves every frame from the video rendered in Mario tiles. It's quite pleasing to see this code working so far. Of course, PNG files are nice to look at, though we can't just drag a PNG file into Super Mario Bros. We'll need to be a bit more creative. Instead, I exported all of the frame data, 1 tile at a time, in the form of a .bin file. Here's all the bytes that I wish to draw into the NES background. Though this poses a good question. How do you draw to the background on the NES? Graphics Part 2. How to draw to the background of the NES. Here's a new ROM that I put together. So far it just sets up the palettes and then crashes the NES. The goal here is to write the string Hello World on the background. The first step is to know where on the background we want to write it. How is the middle of the screen defined in NES terms? Using BizHawk's nametable viewer, we can see the PPU address of each tile. According to this cartridge I already made, it looks like the ideal place to start is address 21CA. Drawing to the nametable is a 2-step process. First, you need to change the PPU's read-write address, and then you write to the PPU. Changing the read-write address requires 2 separate store instructions to address 2006. In this case, I write 21, and then CA, which sets the read-write address to 21CA. Now we need to write Hello World, 1 character at a time. To begin with, which character is H? Looking at all the Mario tiles, H is row 1, column 1, so we'll use hex 11 to draw the letter H. Storing this value at address 2007 is how we communicate with the PPU and draw the tile. I'll compile this ROM and drag it into the emulator. For this, I'll use a compiler called NES ASM. With this ROM loaded in, you can see we've successfully drawn the letter H on screen. If I want to continue and write the rest of Hello World, I'll need to write the letter E next. This can be done by copying the previous 2 lines we wrote and changing it to an E. Notice how we don't need to move the PPU read-write address, as that happens automatically when storing at address 2007. To make this code look nicer, I wrote a lookup table for the entire string, and I'll replace this code up here with a loop that reads from the lookup table and writes to 2007. Now this should print out the entire Hello World string. Ta-da! Now I want to draw all the characters I exported from the music video. Currently in our task, we just defeated Bowser. You'll notice that in the nametable viewer, the screen still has all the tiles from Bowser's castle. The first step here I took was to remove all that. Here's some assembly code that changes the palettes and overwrites every tile on the nametable with a black square. After setting up the pointers to write this at address 300, I'll paste all the bytes for this code and watch the code get filled in through the hex editor. Now to actually execute this code, I'll make the next input non-blank, and I'll write the pointer to address 300. Now I've got a blank canvas. We'll need to write some code to draw the data on screen, but first let's try and compress it. Graphics Part 3. Compress the data into packets. This row of bytes represents a strip of tiles to draw on screen. You might notice that many of these bytes are repeated. The easiest form of compression I could think of was to simply indicate how many of a tile to draw, followed by the ID of the tile to draw. I should also include the address of where this tile is being written, so in total we have turned these 20 bytes into 12 bytes. If we were to take a look at a much busier frame, we can see how this style of compression can immediately begin to backfire, as we have transformed these 20 bytes into 40 bytes. I decided for this video, I'll store this graphical data in two ways, as a row of duplicate tiles in this format, or as a row of individual tiles in this format. Let's take a look at an example. This is the second frame from the video with any changes. You can see there are 14 tiles that need changed. With this system of packets, I can modify only the tiles that need changed. Starting with this tile in the upper right, at address 2119, I will write one tile with the ID CB. Following this format, here are the rest of the packets. I also want to end each group of packets with a terminator. This will tell my code that the data for the frame is complete and we can wait for the next frame. Graphics Part 4, The Limitations of VBlank. I initially had a section here where I would explain how long it takes in CPU cycles to update tiles on the screen. To be honest, this part of the video was a bunch of math and then walking you through my assembly code, and oh wow, it was not entertaining. In summary, there's not enough time using my method to draw an entire 32 by 24 tile image in a single frame. Not even close. I'm going to render this video as 20 by 15 tiles instead. That means there's a lot of blank space around the video, but not much I can do about that. Moving back to C# land, let's adjust for this new resolution and regenerate that .bin file. Right now, we have code to interpret packets as graphical data. We still need code to interpret button presses as packets. Something else I'll be glossing over is a hardware level race condition for my method of waiting for the next frame. Again, it's out of the scope of this video. More hand waving, just know that I read the controller an extra time in a frame to prevent it. You might have noticed that the NES has two screens worth of background. Since the NES runs at 60 FPS, and we're rendering a 30 FPS video, I can take 2 frames to render each image. If I render a frame on the background not being shown, I can seamlessly render 30 FPS video at a larger scale. I'll be switching which background is being shown every 2 frames, that way I don't show the frame I'm changing when it's halfway finished. Graphics Part 5, creating the packets from the frame data and converting it into button presses. Here are the formats for our packets, and here's the data we exported from our C# program. Let's begin by separating these packets into each frame. We can then separate each frame into the individual rows that make it up. All we need to do is write a function that can take in a row of bytes and spit out a packet. Do this for every row, and we got ourselves a full set of packets. You might notice there are 2 terminators here, that's because we're spending 2 frames for each image. Now we'll write a function that takes in the bytes of our packet and convert each byte into the TASVideos button format. Paste in the inputs, wait a few minutes, and we're ready to watch the TAS. In case you want to know what these button inputs are doing, here's an example frame to look at. The first input is to prevent that race condition I glossed over. The next input is how many bytes of packet data need to be written for the next frame. In this case, there are hex 26 bytes to write. The following in bytes is the packet data. Again, in this case, there are hex 26 bytes of packet data. And now we just sit back and watch the TAS. And here it is. We've got the graphics from the Bad Apple music video being rendered inside Super Mario Bros. Through a whole lot of button presses. I'm really happy with this result, though it does seem to be missing something. This is a .wav file. If you take a look up close on an audio editing tool, such as Audacity, you can see that this waveform is not actually continuous, but it is broken into samples. Imagine it as the resolution for the audio. Let's listen to a musical chord, but hear how it sounds at lower and lower sample rates. You can hear how it gets dramatically worse the fewer samples there are per second. Let's learn how a .wav file stores this data. This is done by storing where the sample is in relation to some middle point, in this case 0. The further away a sample is from 0, the larger the number. If we convert these into hexadecimal, we can see these exact numbers being stored inside the WAV file. 06 and D3 are stored in the file as D306, 23 and D8 are stored as D823, 49 and 62 are stored as 6249, and so on. It's not super important for the video, though if you're interested in knowing what the other bytes in the .wav file are, here's a breakdown for that file's header. Not every .wav file's header will look exactly like this, some may contain metadata and other information in here as well, though again, that info isn't really needed here. The .wav file for Bad Apple that I'll be using stores the samples as 16 bits, with 0 as their midpoint, and a sample rate of 48 kHz. If I want to play this audio on the NES, I need to work with the NES limitations. The NES can play 7-bit samples, 0 to 127, with 64 as the midpoint, and it plays one sample whenever I write to address 4011. This means that we will be responsible for playing the audio at the desired sample rate. Here's the plan. I will read from the controller, and then I will store that data at address 4011. This will be happening in a loop. Here's the assembly code for this. You'll notice the comments here are counting CPU cycles. This loop takes 71 cycles per iteration. To determine the sample rate, we could do some real quick math. 71 cycles per loop, about 1.78 million cycles per second. To calculate the sample rate, we will divide the cycles per second with the cycles per loop. In this case, that gives us a sample rate of over 25 kilohertz. 25 kilohertz audio is not too bad coming out of the NES. Let's recap the order of events happening in a frame. We begin a frame by updating the graphics using the packet information stored at address 0. I read the controller to prevent the race condition at the end of the frame. I read the controller to determine the packet length. I read the controller n times to write the packet data. And all the remaining time until the end of a frame is spent reading the controller to play 25 kHz audio. After the frame ends, this loop repeats, and we'll do this for every frame of the music video. Audio Part 2. Generate the inputs and give it a listen. Welcome back to C# land, where I have a puzzle to solve. I need to make sure that the sample I grabbed from the .wav file is the correct sample to play at this moment in time. How do I know which sample to grab? In short, I need to know how many cycles have happened to this frame so far, and since every frame could take a different amount of time to update the graphics and write the packet for next frame, I decided to just write a custom emulator to emulate the frame for me and count cycles. This is a pretty standard NES emulator, though it does support Open Bus. Here's how I set up the emulator to run in my C# code. The number of cycles will be stored in emu.totalcycles. A few lines down, I'll convert cycles into seconds. Then, as long as I still have more than 71 CPU cycles in a frame, I will grab the sample from the WAV file, convert it to 7-bit, add 71 CPU cycles for the next audio sample, and loop. With the program ready, I click a button, and this generates the inputs in the TASVideos button format. It looks like this task will have 5.4 million inputs to paste. Copy that, paste it into TASVideos, and then wait 15 minutes, and we're good to go. You'll notice every frame now takes forever to emulate since we're cramming in as many inputs as possible, but if we were to play it back in real time, how does it sound? Headphone warning. It sounds terrible! And it shouldn't come as a surprise either. Consider how much time in a frame is spent not writing to the audio chip. There's some pretty big gaps. These gaps are actually visible if you take a look at the audio we're creating from the NES. Let's figure out how to fix this. The audio part 3. Fixing the audio. One idea I had was to smoothen out the first audio samples of a frame. Here's how that sounds. It still sounds bad. It would be really nice if we could just somehow send data to the audio chip during the other parts of the frame. And with this plan all figured out, let's write audio data while writing packet data. Here's my code that writes the packet data. As you can see, it is a loop that reads the controller and stores the graphics data. If I were to make this change, now it will alternate between writing graphical data and writing audio data. Well, how does it sound? It sounds much better, but why stop there? We still need to write audio data while updating the graphics. This is done by simply cramming in audio data inside the packets, and a small change to the packet reading loop. And with that, the entire frame now has audio data. The plan has worked, and we now have the full music video looking and sounding good. Step 3. Return to stable gameplay. I wanted to end the task by faking the level transition screen and spawning Mario directly over the axe. Well, how'd I make that work? You might notice that in our music video playing loop, we don't really have any way to exit the loop when the video ends. I made a small modification to this step here, so if I press the A button, it exits the loop by jumping to address 0181, which was the code that lets me write more code. I would walk through the assembly code for this, though it's not really that interesting. It's much more amusing to just watch the bytes get filled in on the hex editor, and watch the name tables be overwritten. First, I set up the level transition screen, and then I replaced the right name table with Bowser's Castle. Now I'm just waiting for a few frames so that this screen lasts the correct length. Now I finally blank the screen, and I draw the rest of Bowser's Castle. And finally, I overwrite almost every byte in RAM. This is kinda like loading a save state. By enabling the non-maskable interrupt and jumping to where Super Mario Bros. Waits for the next frame, I return everything to stable gameplay and Mario falls to the axe, winning the game. No more inputs, the task has ended. Step 4. Even further beyond. I'd like to share some ways to improve this task. Could I improve the audio anymore? Currently, I'm interlacing one write to the audio chip for every byte of graphical data, but some of these frames have very little to write. For frames with a lot of graphical data, I'll stick to one interlaced audio sample, but for frames with very little to write, I could pack around 4 writes to the audio chip for every byte of graphical data. I wrote 4 different audio interlacing functions to be used depending on how much data needs to be written for a given frame. Here's the code that chooses which function to use. Could the main audio reading loop be faster than 71 CPU cycles? As it turns out, yeah. If before the loop begins I set up the X and Y registers, I can speed up the process of strobing the controller. I still need A to be equal to 0 when this begins, so we can only save 2 cycles here. I can also remove this CLC instruction, saving 2 more cycles. This brings the loop down to 67 cycles, which is around 26.6 kHz audio. Of course, the huge drawback here being that I didn't think about that when I made this task, and now it's too late. What about the graphics? Could this be rendered at a larger resolution? I spent a lot of effort looking for ways to increase the resolution, but taking even more time to draw the graphics means we're going to take a huge dip in the audio quality. As an experiment though, what if we remove the audio altogether? Could we play the video at a full 32 by 24 tiles? I also spent a ton of time on this one. In theory, this code could run entirely within VBlank, though it would take over 16,000 cycles more than the available cycles in a frame in order to write the data. How about 60 FPS? As it turns out, I initially thought the video was 60 FPS, and my first test with the graphics was noticeably faster than it was supposed to be, though we'll have to make the resolution smaller since everything will be drawn in 1 frame instead of 2. How about color video? Something I wanted to try was rendering a non-grayscale video, and what I found was that, shockingly enough, I wouldn't even need to change my assembly code at all in order to do this. The system of packets was designed for writing to the name tables, but it could be used to write to any address on the PPU. The attribute tables and even color palettes could be changed with this existing code. Suppose, for instance, I wanted to render this trailer for my indie game inside Super Mario Bros. The real difficult part here would be converting the frames into Mario tiles. While this step was easy for the black and white video, if I have 64 potential colors to choose from, divvied up into 4 color palettes, and the limitations of the attribute tables, where do I begin for this conversion? Let's begin by taking a frame from the video and shrinking it down to the resolution we'll render it inside Super Mario Bros. Let's set every pixel to the closest color on the NES palette. Right now this has about 35 colors in it, so it's not quite NES ready. The NES background can have up to 13 colors, a single background color for all 4 palettes, and 3 more colors for each palette. Trimming for only the top 13 used colors gives us this. The attribute tables of the NES will subdivide this image into 16 pixel chunks, and each of these chunks will be assigned a palette. The first problem, how do we choose which colors to assign to which palette? Let's tally up the top 4 colors in every chunk. I wanted to know which color exists in the most palettes. This will be our background color since that color is used in every palette. Now we group every remaining color into their most popular tri-color arrangement, and now we force every 16 pixel chunk to use colors exclusively in the palette that most represents that chunk. And finally, we can use the same method as before to draw the image using Mario tiles. Look at that! It's barely recognizable! I found the title screen for my game rendered this way was laughably unreadable. Now all I need to do is convert the entire trailer for my game and... I wonder... So yeah, I got Doom inside Super Mario Bros. Keep in mind, this is not the source code of Doom ported inside the NES, this is just Super Mario Bros. Being a video player, though I'm really happy with the results. In theory, this could be used to play just about any 4x3 video, as long as you're willing to have the graphics completely ruined. And that about wraps things up for this video. All of the assembly code can be found in the TASVideos submission, linked in the description. If you want to know how this task can beat Mario 3 in less than a quarter of a second, I plan to explain that one next. But what if I could beat Mario 3 in 5 millionths of a second? Stick around. By the way, if you want to support me, so I can make more videos like this, consider checking out my game Fantastic Fist. It's a keyboard and mouse platforming game about punching things. There's a free demo and a link in the description. And with that, I'll see you around. Alright, and if you asked why I made this, it was fun.